First of all, I'm going to introduce Naomi Eisenstadt, who's our first speaker, and she's going to be speaking about teenagers, love and money, and how both are essential. Naomi is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford and a trustee of Save the Children in Scotland. She spent several years working first in nurseries, I think, in this country, and then in management positions in children's charities. In 1999, Naomi became the first director of the Sure Start unit in the UK government, and I think that's when I first met Naomi, because I was working in Sure Start at the time in a local authority. And she had responsibility for early education, childcare, parenting policy, and extended schools. So the whole breadth of it, really. She then spent 1 year as the Secretary of State's Chief Advisor on Children's Services. Her last 3 years before leaving the civil service were as Director of the Social Exclusion Task Force. And a key achievement in the task force was the publication of Think Family, which a series of policy proposals on the interaction of parent circumstances and their children's outcomes. So it really helped shape and form the framework for some of the practice that we see today. Naomi's key interests are in children's services, poverty and its impact on children, and family policy. So I'm going to hand over to Naomi now to talk to us, and then she'll have some time for questions at the end, because Naomi has to leave before the panel discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Satwat. Good goodness, I'll have to stand by the side. Thanks very much, Satwat. I'm going to talk about love and money, because most of the day you're going to be talking about love. And I am, the one bit of my career that Satwat didn't mention is that I'm the independent advisor on poverty to the Scottish Government. And I have to say that it's a pleasure to do it, because the Scottish Government is actually interested in poverty issues and already has agreed to enact some of the recommendations I made in my report, Shifting the Curve. In terms of what Satwat just said, my background is early years. So basically what I'm going to say is that we have a massive evidence on early years, and we need a similar evidence on young people, because, I mean, I'm of course, the one who is partially responsible with loads and loads of other people, but my big fear now is that we have oversold under fives. And I'll explain why as I go along, and then link that to the issues of poverty and young people. So first of all, what do we mean? I don't like that the UK government is taking away the notion about income has nothing to do with poverty, what are the root causes of poverty. In my view, poverty is not having enough money to do stuff, or to live in a decent place, or to get on the bus or the train, or to just, buy your kid a Christmas present. I mean, whatever it is about lack of adequate resources to participate in what we think of as social norms. And those social norms vary enormously internationally, and they vary enormously really from different parts of the country. So when you look at minimum income standards, it will be different for London from rural Shetland. And when I went to Shetland, they were a bit cross with me. I said, the difficulty here is not that you're poor, it's that stuff costs so much more. So income alone is not a key, is a key measure, because the costs of things are different in different parts of the country. And of course, the biggest examples are housing in London and fuel costs in Shetland. Or the idea that a car is a luxury. Well, not if you live in a rural area. So those fine issues about what poverty is. Inequality is about the difference between the richest and the poorest, or the bottom 10% and the top 10%. Countries that are more unequal have less social cohesion, they have poorer public services, there are all sorts of reasons why inequality is bad for everyone. And disadvantage is features that limit equality of opportunity. So there are all sorts of things that are a disadvantage that may not be a disadvantage if you have enough money, but are a disadvantage if you don't have enough money, but are clearly a disadvantage. So there would be a big debate, interestingly enough, in the deaf community on whether that's a disadvantage or not, or whether sign language is mother tongue to deaf people. But some people would consider it a disadvantage. But it's separate from. Of course, disadvantage interacts with, because things like disabilities make it more expensive to live what we would call participate in social norms. So having an interpreter with you all the time costs a lot of money. That's what you would need to participate in social norms. So they're used interchangeably in ways that irritate me, but I think it's quite important to be clear what we mean when we're talking about it. So policy and government. What's the role of government? Well, the difficulty with the current UK government, less so with the Scottish government, but sometimes, is that I think that there's two key roles for government. One is reducing pressures and the other is enhancing capabilities. And the difficulty we've had from DWP in the last 10 years is that pressures have increased, not reduced. And my main argument in all this is that it's very difficult to enhance capabilities if you don't at the same time reduce pressures. If you increase pressures on families and then expect them to be better parents, whatever that means, then I think you're going to fail. So my line is always, I'll go to the parenting class if you hold it in a free laundrette. If you deal with what I'm worried about as well as what you're worried about. And the trouble with government is that government and policymakers always want people to want what the government thinks they need. And they just don't interact. Very often it's quite different what people think that they need and what government thinks how they want them to act. So while you're continuing to increase pressures on families, it's very, very difficult to enhance capabilities because it's not what I'm worried about. The one that I always bring up is food. So, people think that poor people don't give their children good food to eat because they don't know what's good food. It's absolute nonsense. They absolutely know. They don't give it to them because it's more expensive, because there's more waste, and because you can't afford the absolute hassle of try a little. If you don't like it, have something else. Poor people can't afford that. They'll give their children what they know they can eat. I read a wonderful a book. I read this. If I'm going to read a book from cover to cover, the only reason I do it is because I've agreed to review it. So I look at interesting books and think, well, if I agree to review this, then I'll have to read it. It was about children and food. So it's much more about, not adolescents, I would say 8 to 12-year-olds in Sweden. And it was all about immigrant families in Sweden. And the immigrant mothers were desperate to hold on to their cultural background, as most families are, by giving their children the food from whichever country they came from. The immigrant children complained to the parents, well, the Swedish kids eat burgers and chips, we want burgers and chips. So the mothers felt really bad and gave in and gave their kids burgers and chips. And the Swedish mothers looked at the immigrant mothers and said, aren't they rubbish mothers? They give their kids burgers and chips. So these poor women could not win. In terms of the pressures they were under, in terms of what children were wanting, what the culture thought that they should give their kids. But it's all harder if you have particular circumstances in which you live. So I'm going to give you some of the evidence on early years, and the only reason I'm doing it is because I want you to think about, have you ever seen similar graphs, diagrams, evidence stories about adolescents and young people? We have had years and years and years and years of proving how important early education is. I'm afraid to say, maybe other people in this room disagree with me, we have no evidence based on the efficacy of youth work in any scientific sense. So what I would argue with you is when you're watching these slides, think about what would that look like for teenagers, and why don't we have it for teenagers, and how much more powerful our policy arguments would be if we did. So here's what we know. The links between socioeconomic status and factors affecting child development. This is old stuff, but sadly it's not changed. There's a perfect gradient. It's Michael Marmot's perfect social gradient. School readiness at 3, much more likely if your income quintile 63%. It's half the number if you're in the poorest quintile. Vocabulary at 5, again, it's slightly over half the number. 35% have a decent score at 5 if you're in the poorest quintile. If you're in the richest quintile, it's 61%. The important thing to look at, though, and I always say that when I show these graphs, is that if it's 32%, that means 32% do. It's not 0, and it's not 100% for the wealthy kids. It's a gradient. So that means there's need across the social class gradient. It means that poverty is not deterministic in terms of poor outcomes. It lowers the chances. It makes it less likely. But risk is not determination. And sometimes the way we talk about poor families assumes that they all have poor school readiness, or they all are hyperactive, or they all, and it's very disrespectful to poor families who, against the odds, can achieve for their children. It's not deterministic. So impact of preschool evident at age 11. This shows what high quality early education does. This is the kind of thing. Could we have something similar on impact on teenage behavior on youth clubs? I've never seen it, maybe we can't do it, but it is the kind of evidence that over 20 years convinced government that this was really important, and in some sense we won the argument. Because no political party will go to the country now without a story on early years in childcare, which wasn't true 20 years ago. 1997, the only major party that had anything in their manifesto on early years was Labour. 2005, they all did. 2010, they all did. They all have slightly different takes on it, but they all have it in. And yet you don't see similar stories. So it works building the evidence base. It takes a long time, but it works. The one that I want you to notice, which I think is really important, is that the most important factors in terms of determining school at 11 are mother's education and home learning environment. And home learning environment, no matter what they tell you about parenting programs, it's the hardest thing to change. It's very hard to change. The evidence on the efficacy of the programs is weak. There are some, but they have very high dropout rates. They're very expensive. So in my view, again, the best way to deal with home learning environment is to reduce pressures on families. And then I think we'd have better success on improving home. And the other thing is that, I don't know this, but I have a sense that by now, parents know when you're asked the question, do you read to your child every night, they're meant to say yes. I just don't assume, any piece of research that relies on parent reports, I would, be a bit skeptical about, and we all do it. Certainly I did it. But, as I said, a good start is not inoculation. And the danger in the early years story, and particularly on the brain research, is that it's perceived as inoculation. And it isn't. Stuff happens. The impact of primary school is an enormous factor in continuing the benefits gained in early education. And no matter how good the early education is, a lot of those benefits will fade if you don't have quality primary school. The transition from primary to secondary is a big dip. We know that. We know that the transition from primary to secondary is enormously difficult for young people. And yet we don't know, well, what do you do about that? What would be the policy response to that? And there's family shocks. Stuff happens after 5. Now, a good start is, it certainly builds more resilience in terms of children as stuff happens, but it isn't inoculation. And, and also I just think, even if you look at the research, we want our kids to have a good life throughout life. Not just 5, that's over, we've done it, and now it's up to the schools. So a good start increases the odds of good outcomes, but it's not a guarantee, nor, and this is what's really important, a poor start is not a guarantee of poor outcomes. Never too early, never too late. And part of the danger in the overselling of early years is that, particularly in the brain research, and when you talk about brain architecture, there's a sense that, if it doesn't go right, then it's all over. But the science doesn't tell us that, and even if it did in policy terms, it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous in policy terms, because, we never give up on kids. It's just, in social justice terms, it's wrong. So what I'm encouraging in the Scottish government, and we're making we're probably going to be talking about this in January when we've collected data, is a second chance narrative on young people aged 16 to 24. Why? Because it's the period in life when you're exposed to the highest risks, and yet there isn't an evidence base nor a sort of what works story the way there is on early years. I also think there's been an overemphasis on university access, and this is a particular issue in Scotland. I know I'm not supposed to say it, but I will. I think free tuition fees is regressive, because who goes to university? Yep. And we've had massive investment in our universities in Scotland, no cuts in universities, massive cuts in FE. So in terms of what is our policy for the other 60%? Why do we only think about our most, in inverted commas, talented youngsters. What about the rest? And of course, there's the classic social class gradient on which bits of our society benefit most from that investment. So to those who have, they will get more. Isn't that didn't some saint say that or something? I'm Jewish, I'm sorry, I don't know the saints. But yeah, but there is it Matthew who said that? Anyway, so, to those who have, they'll get more. And that's what we're doing by our continued investment. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't invest in higher education. Of course we should. But we need to think, what's our comparable investment in HE? What are the roots? How do we build an economy that, that will help these young people rather than just the university bound? And particularly, we have a silo approach on employment, health, education, leisure, and social pursuits. We've managed to integrate a lot of the thinking on early years. We haven't done a similar integration on teenagers in terms of their mental health needs. We haven't done a similar integration on teenagers and their leisure pursuits. When we did the Sure Start research, one of the things that mothers said about their neighborhoods was that they didn't like the teenagers hanging out on the streets. And I remember my son, when he was really little, he was nervous about the teenagers hanging out on the streets. And then he became a teenager hanging out on the streets. They're not doing anything illegal. I don't understand why they're not citizens like everyone else. And oddly enough, because I'm American, when I was a teenager, that's what we hung out at the mall, actually. We didn't hang out we hung out at the mall. I didn't know it was something bad to do. I never did, the worst thing we did was try on bride dresses. I never shoplifted anything. I never, But, the idea that of a certain age, it is sort of wrong for you to be just on the street as opposed to any other age. I've never heard them complain about, elderly women standing at the bus stop as being intimidating. So young people's employment and qualifications, again, you have the perfect social class gradient, but it's just by qualifications, and we know who gets the degrees and who gets the HNDs and HNCs are equivalent. It's a perfect social class gradient. But what I would point out, which is very interesting and really surprised me, is that for boys, having an HNC or HND, you have a higher employment rate than a degree, which is really, I don't understand it. And I've asked people in Scottish government to explain it to me, and nobody seems to understand it. But it's 68% of boys will be employed post-degree, and 71% with an HNC or HND equivalent. For girls, it's the opposite. For girls, it's 77% and 70%. So girls with a degree will do better, and they do better than boys anyway. I mean, by a big margin. 77% versus 68% is very big difference in terms of who's employed after a degree. But if you go down to your lower qualifications, your employment rates really, really drop quite dramatically. And that's why I'm saying that we need to look very hard at what are we doing for those who aren't going to get that, what we think of as the gold standard. And the answer is not expanding university education, because if all of us went to Oxford, it wouldn't matter going to Oxford. It would be more who you know. The reason that a degree counts is because it's rare. And as soon as you expand it, then of course it becomes less rare, and then it becomes much more, some connections, or where your dad works, or whatever. So current work, what do we know about young people in Scotland? Well, not much. I want to know what happens when they leave school. I hate the expression positive destinations, because a positive destination ranges from flipping burgers to St. Andrews University. And it gets head teachers off the hook, because they can say 95% of our kids go to positive destinations. The data on positive destinations is fabulous. It makes you think there's no problems in Scotland at all, because it doesn't distinguish enough by what is all a positive destination means is once you leave school, you're doing something. And I think we need much more information about, well, is it colleges, is it universities, is it apprenticeships, if it's jobs, what kind of pay the jobs, what's the stability. The one thing I did find out is that, again, kids from the poorest areas, when they leave school for that positive destinations, the richest kids in the first 2 years have maybe, they either go to university or they have 1 or 2 changes. The poorest kids have as many as 5 changes. So that means the positive destination wasn't that positive. that they're moving into a job or into college or out of this, or that didn't work, or, you know, and that in itself is very disruptive in terms of any career prospects. So what are the big issues? What are the policy options? I don't know yet, because I wanted to do the data analysis and actually talk to some young people myself. I mean, you know, the big question I asked when we started doing this work, particularly on the sort of early adulthood, this sort of transition from teens to adulthood. So I know that when I first left university, I certainly wasn't paid as much as when I retired. And we keep saying that we want people to go into careers with progression. So we expect to have less money at that end. But what's the good story? What is our expectation? What would good look like for young people? Because I think it's disgraceful that the minimum wage doesn't kick in until 25. Why should that be? You know, if it's equal work. I mean, what do we expect in terms of housing for young people? You know, more and more moving back in with families because they can't afford private sector rental. Certainly, you know, the idea of buying a house now is becoming more and more unaffordable, even in the poorer bits of Scotland, but particularly in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh. So what would good look like before you start to think about what are the policies that would make good happen? And what about parents? Well, what started with all this? I mean, it's really hard, the tension between emerging independence and the need for guidance and limits. I mean, it's the hardest time because it's when they want you around, but they're never around. It's not like when they're really little and you know that somebody has to be around. So it's that funny issue. The relationships are crucial, but peer relationships are also crucial. The availability of advice is limited. And I would say, you know, the best strategy is to hold your nerve. I'm friendly with the person who was my son is now 35. When he was at school, I saw his tutor lives in my village. And she said to me quite recently, "You held your nerve, didn't you?" And I wasn't sure what she meant. Well, because when he went on his gap year, he went to Colombia and did human rights work in Colombia. You know, and then he got arrested at the G8 summit. I was working in the Department of Education. I got a text that said, "Arrested yesterday, out now, behaving responsibly." You know, I mean, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't end. And I remember having a conversation with him, and I'm sure many of you have had similar conversations. You know, I really admire what you do politically, but it costs me. And I think that's a really, really hard issue. So I think these are my key messages, but I want to end with a nice story about Nathan when he was an adolescent, because one of his friends lived on a narrowboat on the canal. And he stopped going to school at 14 because he was bullied because he didn't bathe very often. And the school said that they couldn't manage the bullying because of the conditions in which he lived. So Nathan and his friends sort of rallied around this kid and just stayed friends with him. And they did cycling together. They just stayed friends with him and saw him quite frequently. And when Nathan came back from the G8 summit, this is of course a while ago, and Dan came over. And I hadn't seen Dan, the kid who grew up on the narrowboat and didn't go to school since 14. I hadn't seen him in about 10 years. And I said to Dan, "So did you go to the G8 summit with Nathan?" And he looked at me and he looked at Nathan and he said, "I'm much too poor to be an anti-capitalist."
So does anybody have any comments? Yep, contributions or questions at this stage?
For me, one of the things that's exercising my mind at the moment is societal attitudes to young people. And I wonder if you think that fuels some of the issues that arise, that we see emerging.
I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is that youth crime is pretty low. Particularly in Scotland, we've got a very good record on youth crime. So there is a perception that is quite difficult to shake. I mean, in London, it would be about young black men. So again, I love telling the stories. When I was doing social exclusion, we launched this thing about white boys and educational attainment, because of course it's white boys that do worst. And there were two black men in the audience from Hackney. One was in youth work, and the other one, I think, was a policeman. And they said to me they were worried about eye off the ball on race. And that was the time when there were big issues about there still are, youth knife crime, about gang crime in London, particularly around black boys. And they said to me that they were really worried about this, and that I could not understand what it felt like for them personally when there's a news story about another black kid knifed somebody. And I looked at them, it's funny, I'm sharing it with you now. I said, well, actually, you'll be surprised I do understand, because that's exactly how I feel every time they show Bernie Madoff on TV. Now, again, I don't know if do you remember Bernie Madoff, the guy with the pyramid scheme who robbed everybody of billions of pounds? Now, it's very interesting. People in this room would not have picked up that he was Jewish. And yet, in terms of racial stereotypes, that was exactly so I was ready to crawl under a rock every time it was on TV. And there'd always be an Israeli flag somewhere in the background. There was, so it's very interesting how, they got it. They got immediately what I meant when I said Bernie Madoff. And I think with young people, there's the same thing. There's a sense of stigma, there's a sense of people don't like me. And I remember talking to Nathan about how, well, when I was a teenager, I got away with everything because I was goody two-shoes. I behaved well at school. They didn't know that I was smoking pot at lunchtime. And I did, but I got away with everything because I was Miss Perfect. My parents thought I was Miss Perfect. And Nathan said to me, well, that's all right for you. You're a girl. Boys can't do that. Mm-hmm. And that was very interesting. That issue about how you're presented and how you present yourself in terms of your peers is very different from the rest. And I think there's a lot of stigma that is unfounded in terms of the actual data on risk, but really affects how young people are seen by others and therefore how they see themselves.
I picked up your reservedness around parenting groups and the parenting programs and the potential for them to have impact. I would probably question that a little bit if I would have had some quite good results. I don't think that the panacea, and quite agree that the reducing pressures has to be the primary focus, particularly at the government level. But I just wondered, we very much focus parenting on the younger in the early years at the moment. We're just beginning to get into looking at parenting groups for older groups of parents and their children together. And I think it's that family learning together that's actually making a difference as opposed to focusing on either parents or young people. And I think maybe linking to the kind of title for today, it's like that relationships and connectedness that perhaps we still need to focus on at a local level to take that forward.
Particularly with adolescents, there's two issues. One is how much the adolescent wants privacy and agency, and that balance between individual agency and privacy and what you share with your parents is very, very tricky. And I think that's why groups with younger children always feel safer and easier, and the advice is easier. It's more straightforward. I think that we're less clear on what the advice should be. But yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing to do. I just think that particularly the English government has seen the parenting programs instead of, not as well as. And part of the participation is always how easy do you make it for people to participate, and that's about food, it's about assertive outreach, it's about timing of meeting, all that stuff makes it really hard. But surely they can be very helpful. The other line is, if the parent doesn't like it, they won't come, but just because they like it, it doesn't mean it works.
We have an interest in this transition into adulthood for young people and the link to poverty and deprivation. And increasingly, I think there's an evidence base that if you come from an affluent background or a less deprived background, there's a bit of flexibility in that transition. You can afford to stay at home until your mid-20s or into your 30s now, and there's that kind of flexibility afforded to you. And with some of the young people we've been working with, one of the young people in particular used the quote that I think is really that he became an instant adult at 16, that there wasn't that flexibility at all. I'm just interested what kind of policy responses we might have to either make that a slightly more equal transition or to support those young people who maybe leave school and whose parents can't support them and they can't stay home.
It's all the things together. It's about what kind of careers advice, and not just what kind of careers advice, it's are there the jobs? How do you build an economy that would have the kinds of jobs that we lost when we lost all the manufacturing industries and the mining and all that, where there weren't natural jobs that became well-paying jobs for people to go to. Now, how do you build? A lot of what the Scottish Government is trying to do is in inclusive growth would be about that. And I would say things like, you know, if the government is doing anything, I mean, the Chancellor's going to announce it today, on capital investment, how do you make your procurement contracts include things like really good apprenticeships, really good local employment? So it can be done, but it requires a real assertive effort. And of course, one of the things about, you know, young people, which I know is going to be talked about later, is that 16 to 18, I mean, these are very particular times in people's lives, and there's enormous diversity in people's own maturity at that age. You know, so having to, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be done, but a lot of it costs a lot of money. But in the longer term, it would save money. But I think the idea about thinking much more about apprenticeships, work-based training, and job creation aimed explicitly at that group, comparable to what we do with university students, would begin to balance that out.
I was going to say thank you very
Thanks
much,
very much.
Naomi. Thank you.